Seth, this is pretty unbelievable. I'm not sure anybody expected this morning. Were you surprised?
A little bit. I mean, there have been reports that they were thinking of it, confirmed that they are in fact about to go forward with this. More precisely, there's a special purpose investment vehicle owning half of it, and the other half apparently soon for sale to the public. So they've gotten some traction here. I mean, there are a fair number of people, 600 people have plunked down $250,000 or so for the right to eventually go into space. So this is all very exciting. Of course, a very separate question, Nicole, is whether that means it's a good investment. There are a lot of things in the world that are exciting that we might like to do as consumers if we could. It doesn't necessarily mean that you want to be an investor in those things.
Do you think he has the right personality for this venture? I mean, it sounds aggressive, but, it seems like this is the thing to do. You mentioned $250,000. You'll get this intergalactic ride. He wants to be the first non-pilot aero expert to actually take the ride. But we've heard of others, right, including Jeff Bezos, Blue Origin. By the way, Richard Branson saying they're trying to get this in the months. He used the word months. And by the end of the next year, we have Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin talking about getting a person there. I mean, and then there's Elon Musk's SpaceX. What about the big powers that behind these things, the personalities?
And that's a lot of what this is, right? These are people who are the incredible salesmen, all of the people you mentioned there, right? And Branson, no less an incredible salesman than the other two you mentioned there, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Now, over the years, if you go back and look at some of his businesses, they haven't all succeeded. Now, he has generally succeeded in raising the capital. Nicole, I always go back to, there was a quote in The Economist. They described his business. I want to read it to you. What they called his approach to business at its best. Launch a company, build a brand, never mind the profits, and flog it at the right moment for a huge gain. And what I love about that is that they said that back in December 1999. So about 20 years ago. The context back then was that he was selling half of Virgin Atlantic, the airline at the time, for $1 billion to Singapore Airlines. And sure enough, kind of like what they were describing there, of course, not knowing what would happen, we can now look back and see that Singapore Airlines sold that stake for pennies on the dollar to Delta more than a decade later. Delta paid $300 million for that. So in that instance, as in so many others, Branson sold high. So the question here, again, one thing is the technology, all very exciting. I'd sure love to ride. But as an investor, is the valuation going to be right? That, of course, is a much more arcane, less sexy, but very important calculation for investors.
He certainly seems genius when you talk about that, for sure. How about this deal? I mean, in order to do this, they're merging with social capital. The investors get 49% opportunity. What do you think of the breakdown of this deal? Does it seem on point?
Yeah, and again, there's so little precedent here that I'm sure not going to be the one to try to establish, the valuation here, and I think that's the problem. Clearly, there's upside, right? If in fact they can be the first of those very exciting ventures to actually get people up in space, do it consistently and safely. There was one fatal accident. I mean, look, this is all risky stuff, right? So you can imagine that if it all goes very well, you would like to be able to look back and have been one of the early investors. But, tough here in terms of comps, right? You think about other industries where you can look around and say, is this a rich valuation? Is it a good deal? Just very hard to do in this case.
There's nothing to compare it to. I mean, even the $250,000 price ticket for the ride, okay. Does that seem like a fair price? I don't know. Okay. I don't know how much it costs to take a ride into space. So
right, there's no reference price for any of it. Yeah. As a consumer or as an investor, right? Exactly. So it really could go either way.
I mean, should it be 500,000 or should it be 100,000? I mean, it's sort of like they picked this 250,000 out of the air. I mean, you're basically immersed in the airline world in Airline Weekly. I wanted to get get your thoughts on some of the other big stories. Boeing, for example, came out with the deliveries. We're seeing the weakness. They're not getting the orders on the 737 MAX. Some of the other airlines, such as Southwest and American, have exposure because they have a lot of these 737 MAX jets in their fleet. What are your big picture thoughts on those?
Yeah, you're right about that. And among the U.S. airlines, you'd like to be Delta, which reports earnings Thursday. Delta unexposed to the MAX, and alone in that regard among the giant U.S. airlines. You mentioned American, Southwest, United, also with less exposure than those two, but certainly exposure. Delta doing very well. It's had a really good run here for a number of years. Very exposed to premium revenue, to long haul revenue. That's been a good thing while the global economy has been strong. So the question is, is it the most exposed also to those things when perhaps that's not where you want to be if there's a future downturn? But for now, they're glad to be where they are, including being lucky to have not ordered Maxes. It's not as if they knew, of course, what was going to happen here. And everybody else waiting to see how long this is going to go on. Early in the Max grounding, I think everybody thought, I mean, look, there were people saying it would only be a matter of weeks. That always seemed a little bit optimistic. But most of us thought that this would be sort of a, maybe a late summer, early fall thing, and that's no longer going to be the case. The question right now is the MAX going to be carrying passengers again anytime this year? And that didn't seem to be a question early on. So a lot of airlines around the world really rooting for this to go well, because look, they don't have a lot of good options. If you're Southwest with 700 Maxes, you don't really want to go out and order Airbus. You've got a lot of scale with Boeing and its 737s, hoping, of course, that it returns to service quickly, but safely, most of all.
Good point. I wanted to ask you last question. When's the best time to get tickets so people get the best prices? I mean, I think that, over the years, they pack the planes. Sometimes they have fewer planes. They hedge on oil. We've had some consolidation. The pricing power that the airlines have, and just to fly anywhere seems so expensive. I mean, just from looking around and poking over the last year or so, what are your thoughts on pricing, and where's that going? It feels like a lot to even try and do a weekend getaway.
It does. I've felt it too. I'm flying down to Fort Lauderdale this weekend myself, and was amazed at how expensive it is to go down to Florida in the middle of July, where you wouldn't think.
Yeah, what's the deal with that, Seth?
Yeah, well, and in the case of Fort Lauderdale, there's a runway closure there, a little bit more capacity constraint. But you're right, in general, it's expensive. I think everybody knows that if you wait until the last minute to buy airline tickets, it's very expensive. Obviously, business travelers tend to travel there, people who are less price sensitive. What a lot of people don't realize, Nicole, is that the opposite isn't exactly true. It's not the early bird who always gets the cheap airline ticket. A lot of times there's this sweet spot kind of between a month and 2 months before you fly. And sure enough, I was just online before looking for some tickets for a potential trip just 3 or 4 weeks from now. I was actually surprised at, relatively at least, with everything being as expensive as it is, how inexpensive it was. So sometimes patience pays, and it just has to do with consumer psychology. Yeah, people who travel at the last minute usually willing to pay more because maybe there's a lot of money in it, right? Business travel. But people who book way before they travel also sometimes kind of really need that trip. They're planning a honeymoon or something very special. The most discretionary travelers are those who book a month or two before they travel. They might or might not go, depending on whether it's cheap. And so the trick is that even if you're one of those people who really needs to travel and you know it way far in advance, sometimes if you can stomach waiting, pretend that you're a discretionary traveler, you'll be able to save a little bit of money.